If you look at the website, you'll see that filling in for the materials for last week, in addition to putting the audio and the video in there, there's another short document that isn't included in the handout that I gave you, but is a summary of the sort of model of senses and their relation to reference that I laid out at the end last time. So that might be something you want to consult. Let me just remind you that the puzzle, as it were, is that the notion of sense is being asked to do two quite different jobs for Frege. On the one hand, he says senses determine reference. On the other hand, he says senses are what we grasp when we grasp what's expressed by some locution. And to have a different sense is to have a different cognitive value. And I mentioned that Putnam was at the center of a movement of thought in the 80s that said really these are incompatible. You have to take your choice. His characteristic slogan-y title was "Meanings Ain't in the Head." The thought was cognitive values, what you grasp, is in the head, but that isn't enough to determine the referent. And that's where the now vast literature on twin Earth examples grew up around that. I may not have mentioned last time, there's a good collection called the Twin Earth Chronicles of essays just addressed to the use people have made of that thought experiment. But here are the main features of the model that I laid out. I said first, start with modes of presentation, Hauptgegeben Signs. I understand the mode of presentation of a Bedeutung just to be a function that has it as its value. The function has that has the Bedeutung as its value only when it's applied to an argument. So we could think of a function applied to an argument as a mode of presentation. And I pointed out that his examples already from the Begriffsschrift, where he says you can pick this point in the triangle out either as the unique point of intersection of these two median lines of it, or as the unique point of intersection of these other two median lines. That's a non-trivial identity because there are two different modes of presentation involved. Both of those are applying a function, the intersection of two arguments, the two lines. So they have that form of a mode of of a function applied to an argument. Any definite description is going to have that form. So I suggested we think of modes of presentation as functions applied to arguments, fatas, but pointed out that that's just a mode of computation, a computation of the value. And that's not just a metaphor to call this a computation. We can carry that out as far as the Curry-Howard correspondence that lines up functions, computations, and logics, logical derivations. So there's a good thing to mean by mode of presentation. I pointed out, second, that what he says is not that senses are modes of presentation, but that they contain modes of presentation. And that's important because the values of functions don't contain either the function or the argument, but it makes perfect sense to think of a sense as a set of modes of presentation, all of the same Bedeutung. Well, what's the principle of unity of the different modes of presentation that make up one sense, as opposed to the difference in modes of presentation that still picking out the same Bedeutung can flank an informative identity. I said, well, here we have to remember that, again, right from the beginning, Frege has been emphasizing that if we write down an expression, his perspicuous notation is particularly designed to exhibit this feature, that underdetermines its analysis in terms of functions and arguments. An expression like 2 to the 4th can be thought of as applying the function raised to the 4th power to the argument 2, or you can think of it as applying the raised to the x raised 2 to the x power to the argument 4, or you can see it as applying the function raise x to the yth power to the arguments 2 and 4. The expression contains all those function argument analyses. And so I suggested that's the principle of identity and individuation for senses, is they all have to pick out the same Bedeutung. In this case, 2 to the 4th, it's 16. But though that's necessary, it's not sufficient for them to be modes of presentation that are contained in the same sense. What those modes of presentation have in common is they all correspond to function argument analyses of the very same expression. So the second interpretive suggestion was that you think of senses as constellations of modes of presentation, that is, of computations of functions applied to arguments whose value is the Bedeutung of the expression whose sense we're talking about. Now, what about the cognitive value side of it? The claim was each one of those modes of presentation, each one of those ways of computing a Bedeutung corresponds to a pattern of inferential involvements of the expression. So there are things that follow from an expression because it's analyzable as applying the function raised to the 4th power to something. For instance, that's related to the product of raising it to the 2nd power and raising it to the 2nd power. So the claim was that each one of those modes of presentation that are contained in the sense, each one of those corresponds to a pattern of inferential involvements of the expression that expresses that sense, so that the different function argument analyses of the expression are articulating different patterns of inference that it's involved in. That's an analysis of those. And my claim was that the inferential roles that are determined in that way, the inferences that are good salva consequentiae, this one's good, and you can make the substitutions that correspond to discerning this function rather than that, saving the goodness of the inferences, that the inferential roles in that sense are what he means by cognitive values. They are what you grasp when you understand a concept, which is not to say that they're all transparent to you. The model of grasping is something he uses rather than the model of seeing. And I think it's precisely because I can grasp this bottle and I have control over it. I've grasped this bottle, even though not all of it is in contact with my hand. There's parts of it that I'm waving around that are not something that I can feel in my hand. But, waving the stick around, I'm wielding it, I grasp that stick, even though there are parts of it that are not sort of immediately grasped, part of the immediate grasp of it. So in that sense, Frege's talk about grasp of sense does not presuppose that these are transparent to us, that for instance, we're aware of all the different modes of presentation that are contained in it, or even that we can carry out the computation that would let us say what the Bedeutung is by asserting a non-trivial identity that had this sense on one side and some other sense comprising a different set of modes of presentation of that same thing. So my claim is that the interpreters of Frege, who thought of it as a psychological notion, were mistaken. It's an inferential semantic notion. It's not psychological. It's not even epistemological. One can get the idea that it is because he says, look, you could know that the morning star is the morning star and not know that the morning star is the evening star. Well, that's true, but the underlying phenomenon is that those expressions play different inferential roles. If you add them as premises to claims that, I don't know, the mass of the morning star is nearly the same as the mass of the Earth, then from the claim that the morning star is the evening star, you can infer that the mass of the evening star is nearly the same as the mass of the Earth, and that doesn't follow from conjoining that claim with the morning star is the morning star. So he was using somewhat figurative language to express, to talk about this difference in inferential role, which is not in the first instance a psychological or even really an epistemological notion. So those are the basic features of the model of senses that I recommended at the end last time. And the thought I had in mind is in having us move to talk about Bolzano after seeing that model, is that Bolzano gives, if anything, a more articulated version of the claim that if you give, of the connection between giving a function argument analysis of an expression on the one hand and determining its inferential role on the other. And that's because he gives us the first real notion, first real philosophical theory of consequence in general that anybody has ever had. So that's particularly the focus of our foray into the forest of Bolzano. But given that thematic excuse, I have from the beginning pitched Frege as a figure who needs to be understood in connection with his predecessor Kant on the one hand and his successor Wittgenstein on the other. Well, the real missing link, I want to say, between Kant and Frege is Bolzano. And even though Frege had never read a word of Bolzano, he reworks some of the same ideas in fascinatingly different ways. They're interesting both because of the overlap. The central notion for both of them is substitution and the idea of noting invariance under substitution. That's the key idea that both of them are working with. It's the core of Bolzano's notion of consequence, and it's the core of Frege's notion of a function. As a mnemonic or just a reminder that the world sometimes rhymes, when I talk about Bolzano as the link between, conceptually, the link between Kant and Frege, Bolzano was born in 1781, the year Kant published The Critique of Pure Reason, and he died in 1848, the year Frege was born. So chronologically, he is the missing piece. He fits ideally in there. At the end, I want to say something more about the sort of intellectual historical situation that Bolzano was in, sort of fill in something about his place in the history of 19th century philosophy. I want to leave that to the end because I want to get right to the chase, to the conceptual core of them. But I do want to remind you that Bolzano undoubtedly is more famous as a mathematician than he is as a philosopher. I mentioned that he was the first one to prove the intermediate value theorem, which was very important in real analysis in the 19th century and since. He uses as a lemma along the way, well, actually as a lemma along the way, he proves what's now known as the Bolzano-Weierstrass theorem, which is actually more powerful than the intermediate value theorem. But all of this is downstream of his definition of a limit, which mathematicians think of. It's the Weierstrass definition of a limit. It's the epsilon delta definition that says L is the limit of a sequence S, just in case, no matter how small an epsilon, a difference from L you're looking for, pick some arbitrary small epsilon difference from that. There is some delta, some distance out you can go in the sequence such that the element you get to there will be closer than epsilon to the limit. There's some delta, some number of steps you can take. This was both absolutely unprecedented and transformative as clarifying a notion which hitherto had been discussed in terms of infinitesimals, infinitely small quantities, sort of referred to by, the thought was the dx dt Newtonian formulation, but ontologically really mysterious, and so conceptually not a good foundation. So, I mean, that mathematical stuff wasn't rediscovered until the 1850s, and then they said, yes. So he anticipated Weierstrass by 25 years. Now, I do need to do a little bit of setup in Bolzano's metaphysics in order to get to the critical definition of deducibility consequence, or whatever that is the first item on your handout. And I'm going to tell the story a little bit differently than Bolzano does, and as a result, differently than his commentators who mostly follow him in the way they do it. Mine, I'm going to be picking out a subset of the story that he tells before he introduces it, because I think some of it isn't necessary. I'll mention sort of what I'm leaving out afterwards. He starts his story with sentence-shaped objective items. He calls Sätze, singular Satz. Satz can mean just sentence, but it often means proposition, and I think that's not a bad way of translating his Satz. But he insists these are not things in anybody's head. Think of Frege saying the same thing. These are objective. They are what they are independently of us, but we think by grasping them, by getting in touch with them, and again, reverberations with Frege. He says, look, these are not actual. They don't exist, if by exist you mean being spatiotemporal, being involved in causal interactions. They aren't like that. He, unlike Frege, is perfectly happy to call them abstract objects, abstracta. I say abstracta. I shouldn't say abstract objects. They're not objects for him. They're just Sätze. So he starts with these things. In this regard, as in many others, he's a Kantian. He starts his analysis with judgeable contents, even though when he says judgment, Urteil, he means judgings, and that's the subjective act of grasping one of these Sätze that he has. And the key thing, next point about the Sätze, is they have parts. And the part of a Satz could be another Satz. In a conjunction, the conjuncts are Sätze that are part of that conjunctive Satz. But they needn't be. And if they're not, all the parts of Sätze that are not other Sätze are Vorstellungen. Vorstellung is Kant's word. It is in all the English translations of Bolzano, it's translated as idea, which is just wrong. It means representation. That's the way Kant uses it. For Kant, it's a genus that includes intuitions and concepts, and both of those will be Vorstellungen for Bolzano as well. He uses Kantian terminology, talks about, we'll see, he has a definition of analytic and synthetic judgments. He has a definition of Anschauung, intuition, a definition of Begriff, of concept. It's important that he's using all of this Kantian terminology. I think I mentioned when I was first sort of advertising that we would look in at Bolzano, that I think the juxtaposition of his use of Kantian concepts, by which he means quite different things in many ways than Kant did, but always with an eye on the original, that this juxtaposition was just a fascinating one, and that in my view, we're just in the earliest days of understanding the relation between them. There is a book that was written by one of the only 3 students that he has, that he had, that was called The New Anti-Kant, Neue Anti-Kant. And the task that the student set out to do in collaboration with Bolzano was a compare and contrast. Here's what Kant thought, here's what Bolzano says about this. Here's the way this looks, seen through the lens of Bolzano's way of thinking about things. And it has brief summaries of Kantian doctrines, sort of following in the order of the Critique of Pure Reason, which are interesting in their own right. The emphases are in many ways different than what if one of us was writing such a précis of the first critique we would do. And then there's a commentary. And Bolzano would say that the way you should talk about concepts and objects, or about intuitions, or about judgeable contents is like this. And this book was actually published in 1850. And was the basis of what people sort of knew about Bolzano. They hadn't read him, but this anti-Kant, even though it wasn't read by very many people, and as late as the 1920s, when some of the German scholars were interested in Bolzano, they thought the text had been lost forever, that the few copies of this that had been printed had been lost. But it hadn't been, and an English translation of it was published by Sandra Lapointe and Clinton Tolley in 2014 or 2015. So you can actually read this book now. It hasn't been sort of worked over by people who've thought hard about Kant. It's they're coming at it from what it tells us about Bolzano, rather than sort of rethinking the relation between them. Sort of what can we learn about Kant from this? What can we tell from this reading of it? Again, I'll come back to some of this historical matter later, but when we're thinking about juxtaposing Frege with Kant, there is a classic treatment of it that one can go to and look at. And I should say, if you're casting about for something to write about, Bolzano and Frege is a good topic for that. Okay, so the Sätze have got parts. Any part of a Satz that isn't another Satz is a Vorstellung. In addition to the parts of a Satz, which together he calls the content, that is just the mereological whole of those parts, he calls the content of the Satz. But he says, in addition to that, there are modes of combination, Verbindungsarten. And we have to see that those articulate the Sätze, because two Sätze can have the same parts and still be different Sätze. So, for instance, if we identify someone as the ignorant son of a learned father, that's different from identifying that same person as the learned son of an ignorant father. All the pieces are the same, but the thoughts are different. In this case, the two Vorstellungen are different. Another example he uses that has to make us prick up our ears is the expressions 2 to the 4th and 4 to the 2nd, which he says have all the same parts, including, he's thinking, the exponentiation that's tying them together, but the mode of combination of those parts is different. He says the task of logic is analyzing the various kinds of complexity that Sätze can have, the kinds of mode of combination of Vorstellungen and the kinds of Vorstellungen that can be in them. The job of logic is understanding the complexity, the internal complexity of Sätze, which he's in a preliminary way breaking down into the Vorstellungen or other Sätze that are their parts. The mereological sum of those parts is the content, but the Satz, the thing whose internal complexity we want to understand, isn't reducible just to the content in that sense. We have to take account of the mode of combination. Now, what are those modes of combination? What kinds of Vorstellungen can there be? That's the job of logic, he says. I think we can understand what he means by logic as what we might mean by semantics, a theory of meaning or content in a broad sense. But he says it's the job of logic to analyze the complexity of Sätze. That's its job. Next step is it's an internal property of any Satz that it's either true or false. Having those properties is what distinguishes Sätze from anything else. He does not have a notion of truth value as a kind of object. In the 4 volumes of the Wissenschaftslehre, he uses the phrase truth value, Wahrheitswerte, 4 times. And each time he just means whether it's true or false. It's being true or it's being false. He'll use truth value talk, but that isn't one of his technical terms. That's just something he can use to paraphrase this. He insists about his Sätze as Frege probably does about his senses, that they have their truth value eternally. That isn't something that changes. If you have some sentence whose truth value can be different at different times or in different places or different circumstances, he says that's just because it really expresses more than one Satz. It includes a kind of variability in it, a variability as to time, as to place, as to speaker, or whatever. The Sätze are expressed by what Quine usefully called eternal sentences. Quine suggested translating, or anyway mapping, it's raining here now onto it's raining at XYZ at T, filling in those variables. Each instance of it's raining here now expresses one of those eternal sentences, and the eternal sentences are true or false, simplicator, not sometimes one and sometimes the other. Now, I think that's all of the basic metaphysics that we need in order to see what he's doing. I'll mention, and I'll come back to this at least briefly later on, that he doesn't just tell that story and then launch into the discussion of consequence and so on. He has another commitment, which is should be familiar to us from Frege. He says, all the Vorstellungen come with a set of objects that are their extension or their range. And like Frege, he says, that might be an empty set. That is, there may be no object. They might be gegenstandlos, objectless. That's a thing that, a property that a concept can have. But the feature of Vorstellungen, which does not, at least not obviously, follow from what we've said about them being parts of Sätze, is that they actually have objects or extensions. And he's very upfront. He says that relation between a representation and the object it represents, he says that has to be taken as primitive. I don't know how to explain that in terms of other concepts. But I'm also going to claim we don't need to worry about that part of it, at least to be getting on with. His discussion of Sätze and Vorstellungen is all tied up with that name-bearer intuition or commitment. But the strand of thought I want to identify doesn't depend on that. So, the job of logic is to analyze the complexity, the internal complexity of Sätze and Vorstellungen. But he has this amazing idea about how to do that. An idea that even mathematically was way ahead of his time. It's an idea that by the end of the 19th century, by Frege's time, was part and parcel of the new understanding of mathematics that had been achieved over the half century that differentiated them. The change that Richard Dedekind called the move from doing mathematics in a calculational way to denken in Begriffen, thinking in concepts. And Dedekind thought of that change as having been brought about by Galois more than anyone else, who engaged in the enterprise that people were engaged in of trying to figure out how to calculate the roots of higher order polynomials, what the generalization of the notion of number had brought them to. Instead of working on methods to calculate them, he thought about the properties that sets of roots of equations have, and basically introduced what becomes group theory by thinking about the operations you could perform on the roots of one equation to get the roots of another equation. Don't worry about the individual roots anymore. Don't worry about how you could find out what they are. Just think about them from the top down. Think about the properties that the sets of those roots have got. Okay, that was Dedekind thinking about how things changed already with Galois, who, if I remember, was killed in 1819 in the stupid duel. And he was maybe 19 years old at the time. But Bolzano, in 1830, says, well, the way to understand, the way to analyze the internal complexity of Sätze is to think about the relations they stand in to other Sätze. I'm only going to care about the internal complexity of them insofar as it's manifested in or makes a difference to the relations that these Sätze stand in to each other. So again, it's going to be a top-down form of explanation. And he mentions this, maybe it's unhelpfully labeled a holist order of explanation, but he mentions this already in a sort of anti-mereological spirit when he's talking about parts and wholes, when he says, look, we see this issue of you're having to understand the parts in terms of the wholes, having to understand, in this case, the Sätze in terms of their relations to other Sätze. We see this even with ordinary Vorstellungen the human body is made up of parts like the heart, the lungs, the skin, and so on. But you can't say what a heart is without reference to what it does in the whole body. You can't say what the lungs are except by reference to the relations they have to the other parts that form a whole that is a functioning human body. So he said the fact that they are genuinely parts, but that doesn't mean that the parts are intelligible independently of or antecedently to understanding some of the wholes that they can be parts of. So though there's a mereological dimension to his thinking, Vorstellungen are parts of Sätze, it's not an atomistic bottom-up mereology of the sort that nominalists like Leonard and Goodman, founders of modern mereology, along with the Polish logicians, who I'll probably mention later on. Okay, now, so he has this fabulous idea. Let's analyze the internal complexity of Sätze by thinking about their relations to each other. And now we can think about this move in two ways. One is, which relations does he care about? And here, the key relations for him are relations of implication and incompatibility. And I want to say, sort of looking back from our vantage point, these are the key reason relations. The relations that determine what's a reason for what, implication, and what's a reason against what, that's incompatibility. Now, to think about those reason relations, we have to keep firmly in mind Harman's point that distinguishes between inference and implication. Harman makes this point along the way towards an outrageous conclusion. His outrageous conclusion is there is no such thing as deductive inference. Why not? He says, well, if there were such a thing as deductive inference, then surely a paradigm of it would be the inference from P and if P then Q to Q. But that, in general, he says, would be a terrible inference. You might have much better evidence against Q than you had evidence for either P or the conditional. And in that case, the inference you should make should be to give up one of P or if P then Q. He says, well, what does deductive implication relations do for us? Well, it constrains inference. Really, the fact that there's an implication relation between the premises P and if P then Q and the conclusion Q means that you can't be entitled to accept P and if P then Q and reject Q. But it doesn't tell you what to do if you find yourself with these. We have to separate, we have to distinguish between the relations among these contentful items of implication and incompatibility on the one hand, and the actual practices of making inferences, of moving from one set of commitments to another. And Bolzano is absolutely explicit about this as well. The relations that he's talking about are distinct from, but constrain and are relevant to processes of inference. That's what the second two volumes of the Wissenschaftslehre are about. The first two are about these reason relations, and his method of using these reason relations of implication and incompatibility to attribute complexity, structure to the zetsa that stand in these relations as premises and conclusions or members of an incoherent set, and so these are incompatible with the others. In the project of understanding, analyzing the internal complexity of zetsa, his first methodological move is to say, let's do that by looking at the relations they stand into each other, only relations that make a difference, only bits of internal structure that make a difference to those relations are we going to care about? And second, picking those as these reason relations. The third move that he makes is the one that really ties him to Frege. And that's to say, we've got to understand consequence, implication, and incompatibility by the method of variation, by looking at what remains invariant if we change some Vorstellungen in a Satz. Now he says right away, to talk about changing something or varying it, that's got to be metaphorical, because these are eternal items. He's even fussy and says, and by eternal I mean sempiternal, the same at all times, not maybe something spookier and more theological. He's a priest and professor of theology as well, but this ain't that. It's just the same for all times. So really, when we talk about variation, or he'll sometimes say substitution, what we mean is comparing two zetsa that differ only in one of their parts, or more of their parts. We're going to group zetsa together insofar as variations in this sense, differences of their parts, and part of what we're trying to get a grip on is this notion of the modes of combination of them. But our grip on that is going to be gotten by comparing two zetsa that are alike except for this one having this Vorstellung in the place where this other one has something else. That is, we're going to note invariance under substitution or variation, is his term. And what is it that we're going to hold constant? Note the invariance of truth, the truth value of the Satz. The question is, what other zetsa does this Satz get assimilated to in the sense that the other Satz that we're comparing it to differs from our index one only in having one Vorstellung, one part, where the other one has a different part, saving the truth value of the expression without changing the truth value of it. And it's on that basis that he gets to this definition that's the first one on the handout. I wish to give the name of deducibility, Ableitbarkeit. It's a little bit important to keep track of the German here because the notion, he's going to distinguish this from a notion of grounding that he calls Abfolgen, which really is more like contemporary notions of grounding. This is deducibility, but if you skip to the end of this quote, he says, occasionally, since it's customary, I'll say that the propositions follow or can be inferred or derived from the premises. Propositions A, B, C, D, I'll call the premises, M, N, O, the conclusions of and the conclusions follow from or derive from. Sometimes he'll say are a consequence of. That's his notion. Okay. So I say that propositions M and O are deducible from or follow from or are consequences of propositions A, B, C, D with respect to variable parts, I, J, and so on, if every class of ideas whose substitution for IJ that makes all of the premises true also makes all the conclusions true. Every set of parts that we can plug in to the premises that makes the premises true also makes the conclusion true. So what follows from a claim, to say that these conclusions follow from these premises, involves a relativity. It involves a parameter, which is of all the vocabulary, my word, not his, that's in the premises and conclusions. If you look at all the parts, if you look at the content of the premises and the content of the conclusions, the mereological sum of all the parts of them, call that, well, that's the content of the entire set of premises and conclusions in his sense. And he's assuming that there's going to be some repetition. Some of the parts that appear in the premises are going to appear in the conclusions. We can look after a little bit at what happens if that's not the case. But where this is going to be a non-degenerate notion is where there's some overlap between them. And we've got to partition that content, that joint content, into some parts we're going to treat as variable and some we're going to hold fixed. And it's relative to such a partition. Hold these bits fixed and now look at arbitrary variations of the variable ones and look at which of those make all the premises true. And the implication goes through relative to that partition, just in case every set of substitutional variants that makes all the premises true also makes all the conclusions true. Now, parenthetical, he's comfortable working with multiple conclusion implications. He's treating them conjunctively. You could equally get a version that treated the multiple conclusions disjunctively, which is the way Gensen does it. If you're going to do classical proof theory, you care about the disjunctive reading of it, but it's easy to modify his definition to get that. So I'm just going to talk about a single conclusion here. We're looking at picking some expressions to be variable and which substitutions for those, which variants of those make all the premises true, well, the analogs of all the premises true. Do they make the conclusion true? If they do, then it follows relative to this division. This analysis, you can see that the fixed portion corresponds to the function for Frege and the variable part to the arguments. Bolzano has the idea of functionally decomposing expressions in Frege's sense. he's a mathematician. He's got the notion of function. Well, he's got the early 19th century notion of function. It never occurs to him to put these together. It doesn't, partly because he doesn't think of truth values as objects that can be the value of a function. He hasn't made this radical expansion of the notion of function that is one of Frege's big conceptual moves. It would have blown Bolzano's mind to have that explained to him. Yes, connecting in this way the mathematics that he was doing with his thought here. So I want to say something about how remarkable this definition of implication is and look at some of its consequences. Here's a real running start. Abelard, medieval philosopher, worried about whether it was intelligible that there should be consequences that held only hic et nunc, here and now. Could we say that the claim Q follows from P, even though if anything at all were different, it wouldn't? This is a one-off. Right now, I say, if you go through that door, there'll be a catastrophe. He said, well, what about if I go through it in 1 second? No. What about it if I had already stepped in? No, it's only just right now. If you do it, there'll be a catastrophe. But if anything else were different than it is right now, this would not follow. He says, is that even intelligible? What do you mean by follow? How is it different from just saying this and this, asserting the conjunction of these things? What is the oomph of the consequence, the because? It's so. And without mentioning Abelard, but I'm sure with Abelard in mind, Ryle, in his classic essay, maybe the best thing he ever wrote, I esteem it beyond the concept of mind. It's his essay called If, So, and Because, where he introduces the idea of those expressions as inference tickets. And he says the notion of following from, which is captured in different ways by if, which is a sentential connective, and which tells you, well, this is a consequence, and because, which tells you these are premises from which you can get this conclusion. But they're all different ways of expressing one core notion of implication or following from. And he says it's of the essence of that that you're exhibiting some transition as an instance of a pattern. There needs to be some dimension of generality to the claim to make the if, the so, or the because, for them to be in order. So a paradigm for him would be, today is Wednesday, so tomorrow will be Thursday. If today's Wednesday, then tomorrow will be Thursday. Tomorrow will be Thursday because today is Wednesday. We can express that relation in all of these, but it's an instance of a pattern. If January 13th is a Wednesday, then the next day will be a Thursday. There's a pattern of inference that may be left implicit, but if there isn't that dimension of generality, then it isn't a relation of implication. So the first observation I want to make is, although he doesn't put it this way, Bolzano has this idea, and furthermore, has a specific version of it. The generality is precisely which vocabulary you're treating as variable. And Bolzano is going to say, if today is Wednesday, then tomorrow will be Thursday. That's good if you hold fixed the Wednesday and Thursday, today, tomorrow, the next day, the one day and the next day, as variable. I can put in the eternal dates of anything there, and if you've made the premise this day is a Wednesday true, then you've made the conclusion the next day is a Thursday true. That's the pattern. It's a substitutional variation pattern, and it's showing us something about the semantic content of the Sätze that are involved in it. Okay. So that's the first observation. Think of that as the Abelard-Ryle point, that implication involves a certain kind of generality. And Bolzano is giving us a specific kind of generality. It follows from his account that not just that each good implication is good as an instance of a pattern, but he's going to tell us what the pattern is. And that pattern depends on you're supplying this parameter, saying what you're holding fixed and what not. Now, let me say, sort of circle around how remarkable this definition is by saying how it swam into my ken without particularly knowing the Bolzano, just that he had done substitution and Frege did, and Quine at one point points out this argument. So here's a thing. What do you mean by saying that an implication is good in virtue of its logical form, that it's valid? And Quine says, well, if we just have some set of sentences and we know what their truth values are, or anyway it's settled what their truth values are, we can use this method of substitution, hold all the logical vocabulary fixed, and vary the non-logical vocabulary. And an implication is good in virtue of its logical form if it has true premises and a true conclusion, and you can't turn it into a pair of sentences that have true premises and a false conclusion by substituting non-logical for non-logical vocabulary. So I say, it's raining, and if it's raining, then the streets will be wet. So the streets will be wet. He says, now all you have to do is hold the if-then constant as logical vocabulary, and anything you substitute in there, P, and if P then Q, so Q. Anything you substitute in for the non-logical bits of vocabulary will preserve truth. We're noting invariance under substitution, so you get a notion of good in virtue of its logical form just by holding the logical vocabulary fixed. So Quine said, if you want to understand the notion of logical form, all you really need is a criterion of demarcation for logical vocabulary, to say which vocabulary you hold fixed when you're doing this. What distinguishes the vocabulary that you hold fixed as specifically logical vocabulary? And in his book on the philosophy of logic, then he says, well, what considerations might apply to this, and is arguing, well, it's got to be sort of extensional first order logical vocabulary, excluding, for instance, the epsilon of set theory excluding second-order quantifiers, and so on. That's his argument there. Now, I was struck by this observation of Quine's, first of all, by saying, it's not really about truth at all, is it? If you started with a partition of the candidate implications into the good ones and the bad ones, you could just do the same thing. You could say, well, to be good in virtue of its logical form is for an implication to be good, whatever that means, material goodness of some kind, is for it to be good, and for every variant where you replace non-logical by non-logical vocabulary throughout, that's also good. Any such implication is good in virtue of its logical form, and the logical form is the set of its variants that you get by substituting arbitrary non-logical vocabulary for the non-logical vocabulary that's in it. But what Quine doesn't say, and what struck me was, there's nothing special about logical vocabulary in doing that. If you pick out to hold fixed the geological vocabulary, or the theological vocabulary, or the culinary or nautical vocabulary, and look at which implications are good, truth-preserving if you like, but you don't need to understand the goodness of the individual implications that way. To be good in virtue of their form with respect to a vocabulary says, if you hold that vocabulary fixed, you've got a good implication. If you hold that vocabulary fixed and arbitrarily vary the rest of it, if you never get a bad implication by doing that, then it's good in virtue of its nautical vocabulary. Let's say the inference from its being a sloop to its having more than one mast, let's say, is going to be good in virtue of its nautical form, because it doesn't matter sort of how long it is, what's the beam of the boat, the other shape of it, other specifics about its being rigged. No, it doesn't matter. Never mind what color it's painted. So it seemed to me what Quine was really deriving from what he acknowledged as a Bolzano-Frege substitutional criterion was really a notion of form, of implications being good in virtue of their form with respect to some vocabulary that was held fixed. Now, I found this really enlightening about the notion of form, and why thinking about logically good inferences as good in virtue of their form, well, the form really swings free of its being logical form. That notion of form applies to any vocabulary. Yes, Quine says this is why the first problem in the philosophy of logic is the demarcation problem. Which vocabulary is specifically logical? And here, I thought, well, I actually have an answer to that question, and when I thought hard about it. What distinguishes logical vocabulary is its expressive role in making explicit reason relations of implication and incompatibility, which, not coincidentally, are the relations in virtue of which it has the semantic content it does if you're a semantic inferentialist. Okay, well, that was the use I wanted to make of this apparatus. But it showed me, anyway, a conclusion I drew from it is that there's no go to trying to define logic in terms of form. You already need a conception of logic in order to use this notion of form to get logical form. A very sophisticated train of thought about the notion of form in connection with logic is John McFarlane's famous Pitt dissertation, famous because it's referred to more than most published philosophy papers get referred to, but he never published it otherwise. It circulated sort of in samizdat on the concept of logical form. Basically, he's arguing that there were two quite different notions in play. One was a hylomorphic sort of Kantian notion, and another one was much more like this substitutional notion, and that the 20th century notion of logical form was a monstrous chimera trying to combine these notions. I think I'd mentioned Etchemendy's book, The Concept of Logical Consequence. You can think of that as picking up a piece of this same observation. What Bolzano is saying is to talk about an implication being good, to talk about one claim following from another, is always to talk about it following in virtue of its form. It's just that it can be its form with respect to any vocabulary. It can follow in virtue of its logical form, or its theological form, or its geological form, or you can just randomly pick vocabulary to hold fixed and define a notion of form. And what's remarkable about it, most remarkable, I think, is he's completely egalitarian about those different vocabularies that you can hold fixed. All of them articulate some form that's exhibited by the Sätze that are playing the role of premise and conclusion. All of them determine a pattern of inferences that are good, formally good, a kind of generality of inferential relations. But now we can see that there's a structure to it. There's a form corresponding to every partition of the vocabulary into fixed and variable. And each one of those corresponds to a pattern of inferences that these things are involved in. Fix that partition, and that determines, given this definition of Bolzano, that determines a whole class of inferences that are good, of implications that are good. All the ones such that every holding this vocabulary fixed, however we picked out that vocabulary, holding this fixed, every substitution of parts for parts, Vorstellungen for Vorstellungen, that makes the premises true, makes the conclusion true. All of those are good in virtue of the form of those sentences with respect to this partition. And I say it's an egalitarian attitude. No one of them is any better than the other. They're all just patterns of inference that these things are involved in. In particular, there is nothing special for him about holding the logical vocabulary fixed. Indeed, the logical vocabulary, that isn't even one of his concepts. Logic is semantics. It's analyzing the internal structure of Sätze by observing these relations to other Sätze that consist in the good implications and incompatibilities that they stand in to others relative to some form that they exhibit. That form they exhibit is a functional decomposition of them, a way of dividing them into function and argument, fixed vocabulary and variable vocabulary. In Frege's sense, each one of those is corresponds to an inferential pattern, an inferential role in the broad sense that includes the incompatibilities as well as the implications. I should say, because this definition goes through, this set of sentences is incoherent, just in case there isn't any relative to a partition, just in case if you hold this fixed, there isn't any way to any set of substitutions for the parts that makes all of them true together. And you can say this one is incompatible with this if any set of substitutions that makes this one true makes the other one false. Generalize that to whole sets, so he can define incompatibility in just the same way he does implication here, given truth and falsity. But he has the same idea that Frege has, that given a Satz, there are multiple analyses of it into functions and arguments corresponding to every partition of vocabulary into fixed and variable. I mean, he does give special accounts of conditionals and negation and conjunction, the stuff that we would say, oh, these are the logical connectives. And he says, and it is interesting to pick out the form with respect to them. Why? Not because they have any semantic privilege over other ways, over other vocabularies that you might pick as fixed. There is no such semantic privileging of them. These are special because it's particularly easy to say what are the good implications and incompatibilities involving them. They're the ones where it's easy to characterize the inferential patterns that go along with them. Trying to do that for theological vocabulary, well, maybe there's a relation between what's sacred and what's sinful and so on, but it would be a hard job, one he's sort of interested in thinking about with those particular concepts, qua theologian, but it's really hard to say what the patterns of inference that articulate those concepts is, whereas and, not, if then, well, he says there's two notions of conditionals in him. One of them is the truth functional notion, but the other one is the one that codifies, that lets us produce a Satz that says that the conclusion follows from the premises in his intentional sense of follows from. I should say, I always thought about this in terms of truth preservation. A good implication, thought about it, we have these good implications, and now we get sets of them by looking at what's variable salva consequentia in them. If you do this with truth preservation, you have a problem with what follows from false claims. He's perfectly okay with there being implication relations among false, that relate false premises to some conclusions. It doesn't matter whether the premises are true when we're deciding what follows from it. All that matters is that every set of substituents that gives you a variant of the premises that's true also makes the conclusion true. Now, on this egalitarianism, which is one of the things I find most exciting about this definition of follows from, it's a sense of good reason for or good reason against that turns on the content of the non-logical vocabulary in it, about which he's presupposing nothing. He's saying, well, let's look at which of these patterns of inference hold, which substitutions do hold here, and we can analyze the content of any vocabulary this way. Let's just look and see what happens when we do this. So one wants to say, does nothing privilege one way of partitioning the vocabulary into fixed and variable? Aren't some of them better than others? I mean, if I decide in some corpus to treat if-then as fixed, but also everywhere the word Aristotle appears, I'm going to treat that as fixed, and also only the property of being snub-nosed, I'm going to treat that as fixed, and now I'm going to look and see what things, what implications are good, what incompatibilities there are. Surely that's not going to be an interesting notion, an interesting set of patterns, an interesting pattern of implications that I get. And he says, yes, absolutely, that's right. But that doesn't have anything to do with logic. That is with semantics, with the content of these things. As far as what they mean, what their internal complexity is, these are all on a par. What matters is what privileges one of these rather than another, one of these partitions as more important or more enlightening, is epistemological, not semantic. He has a radically experimental view about this. Look at the contents of all your expressions and see which senses of follows teach you something about the way the world is. Some of them will be more helpful in codifying, for instance, laws of nature than others are. Well, so let's go out and see, well, isn't there any sort of methodological advice we can get? Aren't there any ways of thinking about the relations of these contents that do privilege one, that suggest that when we go out, yes, this is going to be cutting at the joints? And he says, well, yes, there is. Read the second 2 volumes, the epistemological volumes of the Wissenschaftslehre. There I'm not talking about the contents, I'm talking about knowledge, about finding stuff out, about evidence. Some of these are going to be much better patterns of inference to exploit in making inferences from the observations you make or the other commitments you have than others. But don't look to logic, don't look to semantics to tell you that. That's a matter of how things are. Whereas this other sort of analysis works sort of no matter what the what the distribution of truth and falsity across the Sätze is. I mean, he's not thinking about different distributions of those. The Sätze are what they are because they come with their truth values. Their internal content is what it is because of the relations they stand in, because of the truth values. Ultimately, we're using truth preservation in order to say what these relations are. But really, all we're getting from that assignment of truth values is the raw materials for the substitutional scalpel that we use to carve up the contents of the Sätze in virtue of the relations they stand in to one another of implication and incompatibility, that is, in virtue of which of the partitions of vocabulary into fixed and variable yield which set of good implications and which not. Now this I just see as a radical semantic vision. It's expressively very powerful. There are very few presuppositions involved in this. It's making, I think, a good division between the semantics that he calls logic, which is about the internal content, not in his sense, but in our sense. Content in his sense is just part of this. A good division between what properly belongs to semantics, called logic, and what properly belongs to epistemology, using these contents, using these aspects of the conceptual contents of the expressions in order to find out how things are, given some things we believe about how things are. But that's methodology. The fourth volume is called Heuristics. When he's writing to his buddy Exner, who says, look, I'm just not going to read all 4 volumes of this. He said, well, forget volume 4. Unless the rest of it makes you think about that, just don't read that at all. Here's the sections to read. Above all, he says, read these ones in the 150s, which are in volume 2, which is where these definitions are. Okay. Well, when we come back from the break, I want to extract some consequences, point out some things about what he's doing here. But this is the basic thing I wanted to get on the table, is this vision that he has, this way of thinking about content in terms of substitution, this radical relativization of consequence to a partition of the vocabulary into fixed and variable, and then the radical egalitarianism about ways of doing that. Each one articulates a genuine dimension of the content because it's a genuine relation to the other zetsa, all of it driven by this idea of noting invariance under substitution, which is what he shares with Frege. Okay, it's 2:25. Let's come back at 2:40. Okay, well, is there any comments or questions anyone feels moved to make after you get this thing out on the table? Yeah.
Yeah, when you talked about Bolzano's theory of how inferences are supposed to allow us to, when you talked about how his theory of like the sentence-like objects are supposed to be explicated by their relationships to each other, it reminded me of Heidegger and his notion of horizon. Is there any deeper connection to be made, or is it just here's 2 philosophers who come to something that kind of seems similar?
I mean, I think Heidegger definitely is thinking about things meaning what they do in their relation to everything else. And the everything else is indefinite in a distinctive way, distinctive of the horizon. I mean, you probably know Bert Dreyfus talks about this as the background. That's a sort of intentionally dumbed down version of the horizon, and he even persuaded John Searle of the importance of this, of the dimension of things whose relation to the thing we're trying to understand are essential, but aren't visible to us. We can't pick them out. We don't have an explicit, articulated view about them. Some things we do, and their relations are essential too, but other things are not articulable, anyway articulated in that way. And that there's always some of that. We can't do without that. And I don't think there's an analog of that in Bolzano. I mean, if you've looked at any of his actual arguments, the tone is remarkably like Frege's tone when he's saying, well, some people say this, but that can't be right because of this, and then, well, here's my view, and being absolutely upfront about what he thinks he has defined and hasn't, and what he thinks follows and doesn't from what he's done. The tone is remarkably similar. Now, let me talk about a couple of consequences from sort of closer to the ground of Bolzano's definitions. One of the essential features of truth functional understandings of consequence is explosion of inconsistencies. That from inconsistent premises, everything follows equally. That's not true on Bolzano's definition. He's defining incompatible claims as relative to a partition. We've got to remember these are triadic relations. There's the premises, the conclusions, and the partition of the vocabulary. But relative to a partition, to be incompatible or incoherent, well, two sets are incompatible if every variant that makes the one true makes at least one of the others false. Now, if your premise set is putting together two incompatible sets as the union of two incompatible sets, which will be true of inconsistent ones, but materially incompatible sets could be like that too. So an irreducibly triadic incompatibility, for instance, I say this fruit is a blackberry, this fruit is red, and this fruit is ripe. Any two of those can be true, but they can't all three be true. Red blackberries are not ripe. As the kids say, blackberries are red when they're green. Acknowledging this incompatibility. Well, if those are your premises, and we hold the red, ripe, and blackberry fixed, then there isn't any set of variants of the remaining vocabulary that could make those all true. Could be the thing that was a blackberry red and ripe. Well, his definition of something following from says every set of substituents that makes all of the premises true makes the conclusion true too. But there isn't any such one. So nothing follows for him from an inconsistent set of premises, from an incoherent set of premises. Not even that same set of premises. If one of those sentences, let's say, is incompatible with the others, from the set of premises, this is a blackberry, this is red, and this is ripe, it doesn't even follow that it's a blackberry, because there's nothing that could make all three of those true and make that true, because there's nothing that could make all three of those. So he doesn't have explosion. Well, that's a good thing. That's not a principle that functions in our reasoning. You don't have to endorse explosion in order to argue by reductio, for instance. It's the essential thing about getting to something inconsistent. It doesn't have to be that everything follows from it. If it's, for instance, unsatisfiable by itself, that could be enough. Some of the people who've looked at Bolzano were struck that his notion of consequence is non-monotonic. Say, if Kant was the greatest philosopher, then he was a greater philosopher than Hegel. Hold the right things fixed. Okay, that goes through. If Kant was the greatest philosopher, and now we throw in another premise, and Kant was not the greatest philosopher. Now nothing follows from that unsatisfiable set. So there are premises that you can add that will infirm an inference. And I would say, well, yes, but that's not the kind of non-monotonicity and defeasibility of inference that, for instance, non-monotonic logicians care about. We care about saying, Tweety's a bird, so that's a good reason to think Tweety flies. Tweety's a bird and Tweety's a penguin is not a good reason to think that Tweety's a bird. We'd like our logic to codify that sense of if then or so as well. But of course it's perfect. There's no incompatibility between being a bird and being a penguin. It's this specific class that doesn't fly that we care about. So yes, it's technically non-monotonic, but I don't actually think that is the kind of monotonicity that's interesting or that makes a difference. It's just downstream of the way he treats incoherent sets of premises as not implying anything as opposed to implying everything. And similarly, you can make contraposition fail for him, but only if, so the move from P implies Q, so not Q implies not P. Well, that doesn't work if one or the other of them is a tautology or an inconsistency. But otherwise it does. So once again, it's a feature of his system that he doesn't have explosion of material incompatibilities, not just inconsistencies. That's good. There are other things, yeah. So it's remarkable that his whole account is top down. He's not showing how to introduce any vocabulary and sort of compute what the reason relations of it are from the reason relations of the base, the way we might do if we had an axiomatic system, or we're doing a Gensen-style proof system. Give me these axioms and I'll show you how to introduce logical vocabulary on the basis of them. It's entirely analytic. So he's not, as Frege is, saying, well, let me specify how all the non-quantificational sentences are inferentially related to each other. And I'll show you how to determine what the inferential relations among the quantificational sentences are. Next time I'll talk some more about just how that goes in him. But that's his great achievement. Peirce did that as well. Bolzano's imagining that the Sätze that we start with include things like all men are mortal. That's a perfectly good Satz. No one is a greater philosopher than Kant. That's a perfectly good Satz. And anyone and no one, well, are those parts that we can substitute for. Well, it's supposed to work if we do, and it doesn't without some fiddling on his part. So, for instance, the quantifier humor at the dawn of Western civilization, Odysseus is captured by Polyphemus the Cyclops, and right at the beginning lies to him. He doesn't tell him his name is Odysseus. When Polyphemus asks him what his name is, he says, "My name is No Man." And we don't know why he did that until the end of the story. They sharpen a log and put out the Cyclops' eye with it, and he roars out of his cave, and the other Cyclops say, "What's the problem?" And he says, "No man is killing me. No man is killing me." And they say, "If no man is killing you, shut up and let us sleep." And they don't come out and chase Odysseus and his people. And now we realize that Odysseus thought about this all the way back at the beginning and told him his name was No Man, setting up this situation. Okay, you know the story. So what follows from Odysseus is killing Polyphemus? Well, follows that Polyphemus is being killed by Odysseus. It follows that Polyphemus is being killed by someone. It follows that Polyphemus is being killed. Well, those all go through. Think about treating Odysseus as variable in here and putting in someone for Odysseus. Well, if someone is killing Polyphemus, then Polyphemus is being killed by someone, and then Polyphemus is being killed by someone, and then Polyphemus is being killed. That goes through. If you put in everyone, same things go through. Polyphemus is being killed by someone if he's being killed by everyone, and he's being killed. But if you put in no one, Polyphemus, so no one is killing Polyphemus, Polyphemus is being killed by no one, that still goes through. But Polyphemus is being killed by someone, now that doesn't go through. On the other hand, that sentence doesn't have the term Odysseus in it for us to vary. So what do we say? Polyphemus is being killed. That doesn't follow either. Well, now should we think that on his definition those things did follow? In fact, he puts in a restriction that maybe you, well, I'll come to the restriction there, that the substituents have to be objectual. That is, there have to be some object they refer to. If they're empty, you don't get good implications. And on his account, no one is a non-objectual Vorstellung. It doesn't represent anyone. And so, nothing, it's not a legitimate substituent when we're deciding what follows from what. Here, the place where he says that, that's worth looking at anyway, is in the middle of the second page of the handout, the other side of it. His definition of an analytic claim, and this is below the bolded part. If a proposition contains even a single idea Vorstellung, which could be arbitrarily changed without altering the truth or falsity of the proposition, Satz, i.e. the propositions which could be attained through it, through arbitrary alteration of this one Vorstellung, would either all be true or all false, provided only they have reference. Okay, that the reference is being objectual, having that's the qualification. Borrowing this expression from Kant, I allow myself to call propositions of this kind analytic. It's analytic if there's any part of it that can be arbitrarily varied without changing the truth value of it. I mean, if we have John is an unmarried male, so John is a bachelor, we can vary John without changing the truth value of that claim, so it's analytic. Some claims involving conjunction and disjunction will be analytic if we treat them both as fixed. What about if we treat one of them as variable? What becomes analytic in these claims? I was talking about the the new anti-Kant that views the Critique of Pure Reason through the lens of Bolzano. Bolzano has a definition of analytic, a division, and here you see all other propositions, that is, all those that do not contain any ideas which can be changed arbitrarily without altering their truth or falsity, I call synthetic. Now that's quite a different way of drawing the distinction between analytic and synthetic claims. You need an excuse to say it's the same distinction. I'm just saying you should draw it differently. Well, what role does it play in Kant that he's saying that role, or one of its central roles, should be played by this division? I mentioned this is important in connection with Frege, because Frege also thinks there's a good distinction between analytic and synthetic, but Kant's drawn in the wrong place. He thinks arithmetic claims are synthetic, and they aren't. They're analytic. Maybe it's worth mentioning here, what does he mean by intuition, by Anschauung, Bolzano now? And he says, well, we can pick out the Vorstellungen, the representations that are intuitions, by two properties that they have. First of all, they're simple in the sense that they have no other Vorstellungen as their parts. He has an argument that there have to be simple Vorstellungen, the parts out of which the others are built. That's not an interesting or original argument. It's pretty much everybody's argument. There have to be simples to have these. Intuitions are simple Vorstellungen. They have no other ones as parts. And when he's thinking about the objects that are the extensions of things, there's the non-objectual ones, there's the mono-objectual ones that have just a single object as their extension, and there's the ones that have multiple objects. Parenthetically, Bolzano never shows any awareness that you can't count objects, that is, the considerations involving sortals that Frege gives us in retails, let me say. In the Grundlagen, basically nobody before him had those thoughts, and Bolzano did not. But he says that's the other property, that intuitions have just one object. They're simple representations that have a single object as their extension. Every other Vorstellung, I shall say, is a concept. So he's distinguishing Begriffe from Anschauungen, Kantian distinction. He's drawing it differently. That's only part of what Kant, I'll say, runs together on this distinction. Kant lines up, this is not a confusion, this is the view, lines up being particular or general, being a representing that's particular or general, idea that's the sort of singular terms that pick out single things, intuitive concepts thought of as general, being the product of passive capacities versus active capacities. That's lined up with intuition and concept. Nothing about the faculties here. Maybe in the epistemology we'll learn that the way we find out about the Sätze that have intuitions as some of their parts is different from the way we find conceptual truths, which are inferential relations among Sätze that have no intuitions as in their content, as part of their parts. Well, as I say, But Bolzano uses the Kantian apparatus, but draws the distinctions differently, and so wants to say different things with them. But there's a reason he's using Kant's distinctions for this. He wants to do some of the same work that Kant is doing, and so you get an interestingly different view. Let me move from the sublime to the mundane a little bit here. Kant was hugely important to Bolzano. He said he read, the critique came out when he was born, and he said he read it first when he was 15, and that was why he decided at 18 he wanted to do philosophy. In 1805, the Austrian emperor, I think it was Francis II, forbade the publication or teaching of any of Kant's works. It was subversive. The mandated curriculum was a sort of Wolffian Leibnizianism that they could see as supportive of the faith. But Kant, too skeptical, couldn't have it. The indictment, the reason they gave when they dismissed Bolzano from his professorship was that he was a Kantian, and that was forbidden. Now, you read the anti-Kant, is he Kantian? Really? Well, yes, he definitely thought he read this stuff, he thought people should read it, he talked this way. Anyway, that's what they condemned him for. He had 3 students, one of whom was the author of the anti-Kant. Well, I forget his name. Prilohecki, I think, was his name. And that's what he did, was publish this anti-Kant in collaboration with Bolzano. 2 of the others went from Czechia to Vienna and became of the school of Brentano. And one of them, in particular, Robert Zimmerman. I don't know if that name makes you prick up your ears. It's Bob Dylan's real name is Robert Zimmerman, but that really is just a silly echo. He was the one who taught Brentano about Bolzano, and Brentano, in turn, who was a maker of schools. There's the school of Brentano. He self-consciously set his students to go out and teach the stuff we're doing here. Among his students that he sent out was Twardowski, who was one of the founders of the Polish School of Logicians that a generation later had Ajukowicz and Lesniewski, who were Tarski's teachers. And Twardowski was a big Bolzano fan. And that was how, was one path that Bolzano got to the rest of the world. Because there was this split between Austrian philosophy and German philosophy dating from 1805, when you couldn't teach Kant in Austria anymore, because for the next 75 years, if not forever, that was absolutely the center of German philosophy. Even if you were again it, that's what you were again, and you were arguing about it. The most prominent person who learned about Bolzano from Brentano, from Zimmerman, was Husserl. And between Twardowski and Husserl, Bolzano came back into both continental philosophy and eventually analytic philosophy. But none of them were the ones Brentano charged with being the Bolzano whisperer. Of the younger generation that he sent forth to Germany now to go and preach Bolzano, and was sent with the manuscript of the Anti-Kant book and with manuscripts from the Wissenschaftslehre, was another young man. Benno was his first name, born Benno Cohen, changed his name so as not to sound Jewish. Benno Carey. Do you recognize that name? Benno Carey is Frege's opponent in the concept and object essay. He's his target in it, because the people who were talking about concepts and objects were the Brentanians, and they were talking about concepts and objects in a very much a Brentano spirit. Benno Carey, as he had changed his name to be, went and was the assistant to Wilhelm Windelband, the founder of Southwest School of Neo-Kantianism in Freiburg. Took Bolzano there to the heart of the rising Neo-Kantian movement, and died at age 31, immediately upon getting there, of an ear infection, reminder of those pre-antibiotic days. By 1891, when Frege wrote his essay responding to Carey, Carey had been dead for 2 years. The replacement of Carey in Freiburg as assistant to Windelband, and then was his Nachfolger, his successor, Heinrich Rickert, was Heidegger's dissertation director. That position would have been Carey's if he'd lived. Well, possibly not, but the standard thing was for the favored assistant to become the new professor. There's no reason to think Frege ever met Carey, but there's this odd sort of synchronicity here that Frege wrote impassioned argument with Bruno Carey, who was the carrier of Bolzano's texts and ideas. Now, we don't know very much about Carey, but he was Brentano's favorite, the one he thought was the best of his generation of the Brentano school. That was why he could be trusted with this. So, I think about excavating these things partly because the interrelations between Austrian philosophy and German philosophy are important and I think interesting. It was Brentano's desire to bring them back together after this disastrous mistake that had condemned a couple of generations of Austrian philosophers to wander in the wilderness because they couldn't read and think hard about Kant. And if you couldn't, basically the Germans didn't see any point in talking to you. You didn't have the language in which we did philosophy. Austrian philosophy, it was important for Brentano to find Bolzano as an Austrian philosopher who didn't go wrong, the path that could have been taken that wouldn't have had this divergence between Austrian and German philosophy. He meant to bring it back together. The one who actually went and taught in Germany, the Catholic Austrian philosopher did, was Husserl. And of course, the peak of Austrian philosophy was Wittgenstein. So in contemporary sort of histories, now contemporary histories of philosophy, when people talk about the relation between Austrian and German philosophy, that there is the Austrian strand. Well, is there something distinctively Austrian about it? This is sort of the question that they have when the two strands, having separated, came back together, so that after a while nobody cared whether you talk funny Austrian German or real German when they come back together. Bolzano in being recovered in this way, very important to the understanding of that movement. And I think of the recovery of Bolzano as an example within sort of hermeneutics of the progression that Leibniz says nothing is for nothing. There's no event so small or insignificant that it isn't an essential part of this best of all possible worlds. Nothing is for nothing. If it looks that way, that's because you're not seeing the role it's playing in the whole. And Kant transposes that thought into a normative mode. It becomes a kind of regulative ideal. You should be able to place any fact or thinker or idea in a systematic whole. You should be aiming to see the role it plays in an ideal, fully rational system. There's a progression from making good inferences to the ratiocinatio polysyllogistica, where you have a whole lot of them, and then the notion of das System, the system that results from that, which was so important for Kant's successors. And Hegel makes that principle, nothing is for nothing within the systematic whole, moves it from being a regulative ideal to be constitutive of a kind of rationality, of recollective rationality. He says it's our job in looking back over the history that's led us to where we are to make it the case that nothing is for nothing, that no piece that was written, no thinker who thought is not understood as having made an essential contribution to where we got. And I really do think of that as part of our sort of obligation to survey what people have written and make something of it if we can. The mere fact that you never heard of Husitz really doesn't say anything about whether there's something there to learn from. The recovery of Bolzano, that I say we're still in very early days of doing this, really, but I think the history is going to look quite different when we've fully taken on board that there was this guy doing, thinking these thoughts then. And we're not just doing it for them, we're doing it for us, because there's interesting stuff there. You can't make something of everything, but given your concerns as you read these things, find the overlooked tidbits, or contingently in my own case, coming to think that the best Frege was the very earliest Frege, the best sellers was the very earliest sellers. Similarly, as it happens with Hegel, each of them had looked back and said, oh, these are juvenile works. I say, no, actually, the path's not taken there. You followed out some of these ideas, but some of the ones you didn't follow out are as worthy of following out as the ones you did. As I say, I think it's just an accident that it always seemed to be the early ones that I moved to. There are people who think that that Kant's Nachlass has got absolutely critical things in it as well. But anyway, just sort of as a wrapper for our putting Bolzano on the table, I wanted to mention this nothing is for nothing, well, hermeneutically, philosophically, anyway. And I hope that I both said enough to indicate the big idea that's at the center both of Bolzano's thought and of Frege's thought, this method of noting invariance under substitution as a way of analyzing the internal structure and complexity of linguistic expressions, of what's expressed by them, in terms of their relation to others. This top-down functionalist, holistic methodology that's encapsulated in Frege's notion of a function, but that is absolutely at the center of Bolzano as well. So, as I say, if anybody wanted to write about Frege and Bolzano, I think that's a fine topic, particularly if the substitutional stuff is what moves you. And if you care about Kant, I think there's reason to care about Bolzano, whether you care about getting to Frege from Kant or not. But the triangular relation is more interesting even than just the Frege to Kant relation. So, for next week, I've not put any new reading on. I may throw in one or two short things, but I want to revert to the question of conceptual novelty in Frege. What resources does he give us for thinking about operating on one set of conceptual contents and producing a new set? Not just some different ones, but genuinely new concepts. And he gives us a lot of resources, and there are correspondingly many readings of what conceptual novelty in Frege is, epitomized in that kite of conceptual novelties, senses of conceptual novelty. So I want to walk through the elements of that kite. We have enough Frege on board to do it, but with each of them there's some details that it's good to have available in order to think about them. If you didn't read Macbeth's first book, the Frege's Logic, and the essay on the proof of Theorem 103, you should read those now. Those are the things that will be the most helpful. Thank you then. See you next time.